Hello, ladies and gents, and many thanks for joining this webinar today on reconsidering trial design for medical device companies to ensure data capture in the challenging COVID-19 era. My name is Paul O'Donoghue, and I am scientific lead for ECOA and mobile health at Medidata, who are a provider of platform software for the running of clinical trials in the life sciences industry. And what I wanted to talk to you today about was really how we see the industry responding to the challenge that we're all really facing in regards to COVID-19, but specifically how we're seeing the industry responding with the use of technology and how we can use technology both to support our response to the pandemic specifically, but also how we're seeing that themes and trends of the use of that kind of technology bleeding over into clinical trials more generally. So there's kind of three high-level themes I'm hoping to talk about today. There's giving a sense of the clinical trial landscape in the before times of all of 4 months ago, and just to give us a sense of the trends that we were seeing before this pandemic arose. And then I'll spend a bit of time talking about the actual specific impact we've seen with COVID-19 and how we've responded using technology as a way to try and mitigate some of the challenges that we faced as an industry. And that'll kind of lead then into an overall discussion around how these technologies as a whole can be used to empower patients within the clinical trial setting. So we only have about 20-25 minutes today, so this is going to be an extremely high-level overview. I'm just going to be talking about some of the themes, some of the high-level considerations, and there will be time at the end for some Q&A, and obviously you should feel absolutely free to reach out to me separately as well if any of these aspects you'd like to get into a bit more detail with. So let's dive into this. So as with really any aspects of our lives, I think we've seen technology shift paradigms across everything we do as a society. And it's really been driven by this access to technology. And this is some great stats around unique users having access to, for example, mobile internet access. We see more than half the world's population who have unique mobile internet access. And that's really only occurred over the last decades, and it's really very hard to understate how big an impact that kind of change in access technology can have on society, can have on the world. And healthcare has been no exception. We've seen patients being much more technology driven and as a result being much more informed and aware of the possibilities for their healthcare treatment. And it's also changing how they're engaging with the clinical trial space. We're seeing patients more proactive in reaching out to actually express interest in taking part in clinical trials, but these patients are much more informed about their disease and the clinical trial process in general. It's a much more knowledgeable patient population that we're now dealing with. And it's a patient population that is much more plugged into technology in all aspects of their lives, and they expect technology to help make their lives better, and that extends to the clinical trial space. And so we've had to respond as an industry, and so the industry has responded by embracing technological solutions, online solutions, and mobile solutions, and we'll get into exactly what those look like a bit later on in the presentation. But how do we actually know what patients want when it comes specifically to clinical trials? And so there's been this term patient centricity, which has been a bit of a buzz phrase within the industry for at least the last decade now. But it's really taking on a lot of strength. There's a lot of momentum behind this now. There's a great summary of this in a recent Economist Intelligence Unit article, which you can access through this link, which really talks about the state of patient centricity at the moment in 2020. But specifically within Medidata, we have a very concrete way of ensuring that we and our solutions are also patient-centric. And we refer to this as our patient centricity by design process. And this is very much a formal way of engaging with patient populations to ensure that, number one, we have an understanding of the patient experience within clinical trials. We understand what patients go through when they engage in a clinical trial, what's important to them, what they're looking for in a clinical trial. And so that really allows us to tailor and build our solutions to meet those needs and expectations. But it's also a very formal checkpoint where we can ensure any of our patient-facing technology is actually going to be put in front of patients and get feedback from patients before we actually release it. So it's a very formal way of ensuring we as a company have accountability, but also visibility into patient needs, and allows us to scale and repeat the development of this technology to ensure we are meeting patient expectations and patient needs, and doing it in a way that's user-friendly for patients. And this literally involves sitting down with patients and talking to them, getting their feedback, understanding their experience, and ultimately testing the technology in them, putting the technology in their hands, getting their feedback, what they like, what they don't like, what they would like the technology to do. And it really allows us to ensure our solutions are user-friendly and are doing what the patients want the technology to do within clinical trials. And this has really allowed us to understand the entire patient experience within a trial and understand it really as a journey. And it starts with patients finding out about trials in the first place, understanding what's available to them to access, learning about those trials, understanding what's involved if they were to engage with the trial. Then there's a whole consenting process they have to go through. Assuming they are accepted onto the trial, they then get randomized into the study. And that's where they engage with the meat of the clinical trial, where they're actually providing data. They are engaging with site visits. They are going in and meeting their clinician. They're going through various physiological measurements as well, which all feeds into the endpoints of the trial. And that can go on for months, in fact, typically years, that the patient is engaged through this clinical trial process. And then at the end of that study, there's obviously then a transitioning out of the study and potential opportunities to share data back with the patient. And so what Medidata has really strived to do is build a platform that allows us to offer all of these solutions as a way of having a technology solution that supports the entire life cycle and entire journey of the patient, to not only give the patient a positive experience, but obviously support the clinical trials and capture the data we need and our sponsors need for running their clinical trials, all within a single platform. And again, we'll get into what that actually looks like in a few slides' time. But first, I did want to pivot to talk specifically about what we've seen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, this is, unprecedented in our lifetime, and this has had a massive impact on all aspects of our lives. And unsurprisingly, it's had a significant impact on the clinical trial experience as well. And this, it's obviously very complicated, but to boil it down to its kind of simplest challenge that we're facing is that suddenly it's potentially become a patient safety issue to have patients come in for site visits. So site visits are an important aspect of a clinical trial. You have the patient coming in, interacting with their clinicians. Often that's where they are providing you data, whether it's completing questionnaires, whether it's physiological measurements. And often their patients are also getting their investigational medication during those site visits. And now suddenly it's potentially a patient safety issue to have them come in for these site visits. So unsurprisingly, we've seen the regulators respond to try and provide some guidance to help us navigate how to deal with this particular situation. I think for anyone who's familiar with the regulatory space, they've been commendably fast within a matter of days for some of them responding to the pandemic to try and get some guidance out there. The guidances are not uniform. They do vary across the different regulatory agencies. I think, from my point of view, the theme has probably been pragmatism. I think many of these guidances are extremely pragmatic. They recognize the challenges we're facing. They're putting patient safety at the core of all thinking around these issues, which I think is obviously absolutely right. And then they're trying to provide a framework that Clinical teams can then respond to, once they've taken care of the patient safety issue, try and maintain some integrity within their clinical trial, try and collect some data, try and ensure patients are receiving the investigational medication, try and ensure we're maintaining the monitoring and oversight of the trials in some way, even if patients are no longer coming in for their site visits. And thankfully, technology has provided us a way of doing that. Again, I'll provide some examples of that presently. So the regulators have been very quick to respond. There's some good material provided in the link in the previous slide you can check out. The industry more broadly, the sponsors and providers within the space have also obviously had to respond. Often that's interpreting the regulatory guidance and coming up with their own responses in light of that. And the entire industry is really challenging or struggling with this, and it comes down to this idea of shifting from site-based visits and assessments to remote home-based situations. And again, I think pragmatism is the theme, and we've seen situations where we've have to balance potentially missing data versus implementing what in traditional times might be considered suboptimal solutions, but that at least give us an opportunity to collect some level of data. And having to make that decision around, is some data within the clinical trial better than just zero data, even if that data is collected in a way that we might not previously have wanted to collect it. A really good summary for anyone who's specifically interested in the aspect of collecting patient-level data, and the CPAT EPRO Consortium in collaboration with the CPAT PIRO Consortium. So this is providers of EPRO technology working with sponsors using EPRO technology, and very quickly produced a guidance where they're trying to summarize the regulatory field and feedback, and also provide some potential solutions and options for responding to the fact that patients might not be completing their site-based visits and what one could do in response to that. Again, there's a link at the slide where you can access some useful information about that. But anyone who's potentially struggling with shifting from site-based to home-based data capture, I definitely recommend you check out this particular publication. And so how have we been actually using technologies to potentially respond to this situation? But also, how do these technologies support the evolution and development of really patient-centric clinical trials? So I'm going to talk about a few specific technologies and how we've seen both the regulators and the industry responding within the context of the pandemic, but also how this technology more broadly can support our striving to really make clinical trials more patient-centric. So I'm going to start with e-consent, so electronic consenting solutions, allowing patients to move away from the traditionally paper-based consenting solutions, so just handing patients a stack of paper that they're expected to read through and then sign off, indicating that they've absorbed all of that information and fully understand it. In response to COVID-19, we've seen varying degrees of support for e-consent before the pandemic. But since the pandemic, really, both across the US, the EU, and the UK specifically, the regulators coming out and suggesting that e-consent solutions are really a very positive response to the possibility of patients not coming in for their site visits anymore. So, the FDA before COVID-19 has been very pro e-consent. We've talked about the fact the consenting process might take place remotely. But specifically in response to COVID-19, they've called out e-consenting solutions as being a viable alternative and a way of keeping patients safe by not having them have to come in for their site visit. Similar in the UK specifically, we've had before COVID-19, the MHRA very positively talking about e-consenting solutions. And more broadly, the EU, in response to COVID-19, pushing this idea that there should be alternatives offered for the consenting solutions and not necessarily getting patients coming in for their site visits. and potentially endangering them by exposing them to the risk of being exposed to COVID-19. And so what does this solution look like? And so within the Medidata platform, it's very much about trying to empower the patient and to give them the information on the study so they actually are informed. It's meant to be an informed consenting process. One of the challenges we've seen with paper is that patients are just not informed after reading reading paper-informed consents. And so looking to take advantage of things like video solutions and providing patients the key information via video, audio, text, giving them a range of different options, but probably most importantly of all, giving them something they can actually take home with them and digest, whether it's something they can access through their own devices at home, so that they can really spend time digesting, potentially discussing the information contained with the consent document with their peers and family, for example. And it gives them the time to make that informed decision about whether they do want to sign up and take part in the clinical trial. And then they obviously have the option to sign the documentation remotely as well through e-signatures if this is acceptable with the local regulators. Okay, so another technology we've really seen coming to the fore in the last few months has been the idea of telemedicine. So the idea of allowing sites to engage with patients via some level of technology at its most basic through a phone call, but typically we're thinking of something like a video call. And again, in response to COVID-19, we've seen the FDA specifically calling out the use of telemedicine platforms as being an alternative for these site visits, echoed within the EU as well, using phone calls as an alternative, as well as video calls, and very similar with the broader EU guidance as well, and the potential to use phone or video calls as a solution. And there's a host of solutions out there, including the Medidata platform own solution. There's various degrees of complexities and considerations around all these different technologies, but there is a number of technologies that are suitable for implementing virtual home-based video-driven visits within the clinical trial setting as well. Okay, so another important aspect that we touched on briefly is around getting investigational product to the patients. And so typically we have the patients coming in for their site visits, and it's during that process that they are handed their actual study treatment, their drug. Again, this being a challenge within the pandemic situation where they might not be coming in for their study visits. And so within Medidata, seeing a big uptake in interest in our randomization and trial supply management tool. And so shifting from this site-based dispensing of study drug to a direct-to-patient approach, where we can have the study team, whether it be the sponsors or the CROs, actually shipping the study drug directly to the patient. So it can all be managed within the Medidata platform. New study drug shipments can be requested. It's shipped from a central depot or a central pharmacy stock directly to the patient's own home. And this can all be tracked and managed centrally within the Medidata platform. So it's a flexible, efficient solution. It simplifies the process for the sites, but most importantly of all, it simplifies the process for the patients. They don't have to come in for their site visit. And it's all, again, centralized within this platform solution within the Medidata ecosystem. And so the final bit I want to talk about is so-called ECOA, patient-level data capture. So typically when we're talking about electronic clinical outcome assessments, normally what we're talking about is questionnaires that are administered via a screen-based technology. So very often you'll see a tablet computer at a site, or you'll see patients using a smartphone, a provisioned smartphone, at home. And increasingly, we're also seeing more interest and more uptake of taking advantage of the patient's own smartphone. So having patients install a study app, for example, on their own device, and then providing data that way. Again, facing this challenge of patients no longer coming in for site visits, but still wanting to be able to capture this data somehow. And so within Medidata, we've seen a shift from site-based data capture to over-the-phone interviews, with then the data actually being entered directly into Rave EDC or into a study device. But we've also, in some circumstances, seen a shift towards using the patient's own device as well. So shifting from patients using a device during their site visit to accessing the questionnaires on their own device in a BYOD setting. And all of this has really kind of been brought together in a very timely way through a big initiative here in Medidata, which is our My Medidata solution. And really this is trying to map onto the patient journey that we talked about earlier, but bringing together a lot of these disparate technologies into a centralized location, providing a patient portal where patients can engage with their clinical trial across all steps of that trial, all steps of that journey, allowing them to, first of all, find out about trials, consent into their trial, they get randomized, they can provide data through our ECOA system, we can support virtual visits through telemedicine, we can be shipping study drug to the patients through our RTSM system, and we can even be capturing wearable data as well. And it's all in a centralized location for the patient, but it also obviously plugs into the broader Medidata ecosystem and is a centralized location for the sites to manage and engage with those patients as well. So this My Medidata solution is, has been going through the patient centricity by design process. So this has been designed in collaboration with patients. It will continue to be designed in collaboration with patients as we expand its capabilities and build more and more solutions and supporting technologies within this My Medidata solution to really try and make the clinical trial experience, which is fundamentally a very big, burdensome process that we're asking patients to do. It's trying to make it a more engaging and a more rewarding experience for the patients. So this technology as a whole is something we've obviously seen used very successfully by a huge number of sponsors, but this specific case study is a top 10 med device company who use the entire Medidata platform. So that included obviously our EDC, but also ECOA and eConsent. They had a huge interest in our patient centricity program. They were very bought into the idea of ensuring their trial was patient-centric. And I think they got a lot specifically out of eConsent. They eConsented their first patient early this year, and they've had a very positive experience using the entire platform and the entire suite of technologies as a way of engaging with their patients, but also obviously ensuring the success of their studies to capture the data that they need to demonstrate the effectiveness of their specific technology. So I think, you know, the theme we've really seen over the last few months is that COVID-19 is accelerating a lot of the trends that we as an industry have been talking about for the last decades, really, at this point. So we see more mixing of modes of technology within a trial. We've seen increased interest in using patients' own technology, and more telemedicine as a way of engaging in patients in their own home. Obviously, e-consent is becoming increasingly important. We're hearing the term virtualization thrown around more and more, or decentralization. This is really just taking this technology and using it to try and push more and more of the study tasks out of the site and into the patient's own home, and removing that burden often of patients having to come in for their site visits. And there probably hasn't been as much talk around wearables and sensors specifically relating to COVID-19, but I think all of the other technology trends will just drive this already high interest in wearables and sensors. And there is obviously some interesting work being done specifically around monitoring COVID symptoms using wearables and sensors. And I think more broadly, and this has really been kind of the defining feature for Medidata, patient platforms as being a key way of actually meaningfully making our industry patient-centric. We have used this term for years now, but Medidata, through its My Medidata patient portal, really trying to shift patients into the center of what we're doing, and providing the patients a way of engaging and controlling how they are engaging with their clinical trials and making the clinical trial, where possible, a lower burden experience for them. So I think some of the key considerations, and particularly in response to COVID-19, you know, we have seen a lot of this pragmatism from the regulators, but ensuring any of significant changes to trials, mid-study changes in particular, are being evaluated by the compliance and QA teams, and still needing to go through, obviously, IRB and EC approval processes if updates have been made to protocols. The same with any interpretation of regulations. You know, we have our own interpretations of those regulations. Ensuring your company and teams are comfortable with those interpretations are important as well. And I think particularly important, we've been scrambling so hard in many circumstances to respond to COVID-19 and come up with some of these solutions, remembering that, you know, this isn't going to be forever. We don't know how long this is going to go on for, how long these disruptions are going to continue. We're already seeing many site visits returning, and we're seeing an uptick in site visits again after the initial drop-off. So these processes do probably have a limited shelf life. But I think it's really important to remember that this is a great opportunity to demonstrate to the regulators in particular that these technologies are viable solutions, and in fact are viable solutions that the patients are looking for. And so while we are looking to respond as quickly as possible, also keeping an eye to the future as well and where we're going with these technologies. Just a bit of a plug for the Medidata blog, which keeps a constant eye on the various regulatory and broader industry trends in response to COVID-19. So this link is a good place to get up to date on the latest we're hearing within the industry for this. And with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A.